Hi everyone, this is Amy Johnson-Crow, and welcome to this week's Archives.com live stream. This week we are going to tackle the topic of deciphering chicken scratch, tips and tricks for reading old handwriting. And this is a topic that if you've been involved in genealogy or family history for any length of time, you have come across some handwriting that sometimes it looks beautiful at first, but then you go to read it and you just have no idea what it says. Or there will be certain letters or certain words that you can't quite make out. And I have a feeling that this is going to be even harder for our descendants, not only as our handwriting gets worse, at least I know my handwriting has certainly gotten worse over the years, but also fewer and fewer schools are actually teaching cursive handwriting. So I think this is a good topic for us to get a really good handle on, and hopefully we can improve not only our own genealogical research skills, but maybe also pass along some skills to our descendants as we're working with them and getting them started in genealogy and family history. So we've got a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, one of the sort of mainstays of working with reading old handwriting is when you come across a word or you come across a letter that doesn't quite make sense, one of the best things to do is to try to compare it with another letter. So when you come across something that you can't quite recognize, find a word that you know that contains that letter or that character that you think it might be, and compare the two. But when you're doing this, it's important that you find one in the same case. So if you're not sure if that one letter is a lowercase g, don't try comparing it to something you know is an uppercase G. You need to have it in the same case, whether it's uppercase or lowercase, so that you can have a fair comparison. So here's an example from the census, and I really like deciphering old handwriting in the census because there are so many words on the page, there is so much handwriting, and there are so many words that repeat themselves, so it's easier to get an idea of, or it's easier to find a character to be able to compare them. And also you're going to have several pages of handwriting from the same person, and that's always critical. You really can't compare letters if they were written by two different people. But when you're working in the census and there's something that you can't quite make out and you can't find a similar character on that page, look at the page before or look at the page after. If it's in the same handwriting, go ahead and compare it. But looking at this example that we have here, and the name that I couldn't quite figure out at first was this name down here at the bottom. Was it Trout, Trouf, Troop, or Traup? I couldn't quite make out that last letter, that last character. What is it? I can make the case that it's a lowercase t and that the person was lazy when they crossed it. It could easily be a lowercase f, or it could even be a lowercase p. So what I want to do is to go through this page and find words that I know and pick out characters and compare it to this unknown character. So I started with the T's. And I can see here the T in Yost. It's very tall and he crosses the T very close to the top of the letter. And I see the same thing with the T in daughter here and the T in daughter down here. That T is very, very straight, it's very closed, and it's crossed almost at the very top of the letter. So I don't think my unknown letter is a T. What about an F? It could easily be an F. Well, if I look at the F in wife, the top of the letter, again, is very tall and very skinny, and he makes a great big loop at the bottom. And as I go through the rest of the page, in other entries where they have wife, I see that he's consistent in how he makes that lowercase f. He has a nice great big loop at the bottom. So I don't think it's an F. Well, what about a P? A lowercase p can be hard to find another example of, but we do have one on this page, up on the very top line. Oops, wrong way. There we go. At the very top line, we have Ralph Ramsey. And that fourth character, it has to be a P. No other letter really fits in there if that's the name Ralph. So I look at this letter and I compare it to that mystery letter down at the bottom, and they look very similar. So I'm comfortable that this last name is Troop. And in going back and looking at previous census years, I find it spelled as Troop with a much more distinct P. So that's how I compared characters to try to figure out that last name. Capital L's and capital S's can look very much alike. And here's an occupation from the 1860 census. Now the question is that occupation lawyer or sawyer? Sawyer is a real occupation. So what occupation did this person have? Is that a capital L or is that a capital S? Well, we're lucky in this particular instance because the occupation above it contains both of those letters. We have livery stable. So we have the capital L here, and a capital S here. Now, if we look at his capital L, he goes up, makes the loop, comes back down, and he crosses the letter again to go into that I. So it's all one long continuous stroke. If we look at his capital S, he goes up, makes the loop, comes back down, but he ends on a little curly Q. He doesn't cross the letter again. It's not continuous into the letter T. It's almost like a backwards treble clef. If you're a musician, you know what I'm talking about. So it's all self-contained. It doesn't flow into the next letter. And we see the same thing up here in servant and down here in servant. So if you read this and if you read this occupation here and you read it as lawyer, congratulations. You got Abraham Lincoln's occupation in the 1860 census correct. He was a lawyer, not a sawyer. A couple other things I'd like to point out. Another set of characters that are easy to mix up are capital M's and capital W's. Let's say that you ran across this name and you weren't sure if that was Willie or Millie. Now, ignoring the fact that it says that this person is male. But, you know, if this is in another census or it's in another document and you weren't sure, if we look up here, we know that that's a capital M. That has to be Mary. So looking at that capital M and this letter down here, I can see that this letter down here is not at all like what we have as the capital M in Mary. So I'm comfortable that that is Willie and not Millie. Now, when you're looking at letters, be careful of flourishes. Now, we're going to stay here on the same page, but there's a name on here that can easily be misread, and that's this name here. Can easily be misread as Hof or Hoff. That looks like H-O or possibly even N-O-U-G-H. Now, I've seen this a lot as a surname, and a lot of families will use a family surname, an ancestral surname, as a first name, like a mother's maiden name, giving that as a first name to one of the sons. So it's not unreasonable to think that this could be Hoff or Hof. But let's compare this letter to what we know about other letters on this page. We have two Henrys, and look how they make a great big flourish there after the H. And we see it again here in this Henry. We also see it up here in Hampton. But what about this? Are we sure that, that's really big. Let's look at how he makes O's. Well, his O here in Hampton is very closed. So is the O in Lincoln, the O in Robert, and the O in Thomas. This loop here is not like any letter O that he makes on this page. So I feel comfortable that instead of this being Hof or Hoff, I feel much more comfortable that this name is Hugh. It's just a capital H with a great big flourish at the end. Now, when you're having trouble reading something else to keep in mind besides comparing letters is to keep words in context. What makes sense? Sometimes we can get so hung up on a letter or a couple of letters that we forget what word would make sense in that context. And when we're doing this, we need to allow for, shall we say, alternate spellings. Back in the 1800s, even early 1900s, and illiteracy rates were a lot higher than they are today. So a lot of times people would spell things exactly as they heard them, not necessarily what the dictionary considered right. So we need to allow for that when we are reading older documents. Case in point, this is a page from a family Bible. It's one of the pages where they recorded births. So I want to zoom in just a little bit so we can get a clearer picture of this entry. And as you're going through here, there might be some words that pop out that you get stuck on because they just, between them being blurred and the handwriting not being all that great, what are we going to do? So as we look through here, we can already see that they had a stop and a start when they started this. Looked like they started with a lowercase g, struck it out, and now we're starting with a capital G. And I believe this, even though it's missing the first E, I believe this first name to be George. So we have George M. Gist was, and what word really fits in here? It's kind of blurry. The handwriting isn't all that great, but the only word that really makes sense here between George M. Gist was and this date, April, notice the alternate spelling of April, 15th, 1860, the word that really only fits in there is born. The next word that is likely to give some problems is this one down here. What in the world is that? Is it an L? Is it an S? Is it an A U? What is that? Well, what makes sense to have between the name of a child, the birth date, and the name of the parents? Son. And what I believe that's actually a U. Again, we have a unique spelling of April. We've put an E at the end of April. So it's not unheard of to think that, okay, they're spelling son with a U. It sounds the same. So we have George M. Gist was born April 15, 1860, son of, and as we read the rest of the entry, another word that pops up down here that might be a little difficult, but you can probably make it out, but it shows the importance of thinking of other spellings, would be died. So he was born on this date, the son of Mordecai Gist and Barbara Gist, and died April 20th, 1860. So even though that's not spelled like we would spell died today, that's not, what would be considered, a proper spelling. We can make it out and we know that that's what it is. Something else that, another place that you might have a little trouble with this record is this middle initial here at the very top. Now remember how we talked about M's and W's can be very similar. But we have this letter here, comparing it to the M in Mordecai and this middle initial that I'm unsure about here in the middle. I feel pretty confident that this character here is an M, that the child's name was George M. Gist. And if I had to go one step further, I would say that Mordecai's middle initial is probably W, not M. Both of the M's end very low with a little tiny loop, and this W, what I believe is a W, ends very, very high and is more open. I believe this to be a capital W. Double S's. Now here's a case where how we write a letter, or in this case 2 letters, has actually changed over the years. This place down here, this is from the 1871 English census, but you will see this in the United States as well. And we have this place down here, and if you read this with modern eyes, you could easily read this place as clay crop, which could make sense. You have an outcropping of stones or an outcropping of rocks, so clay crop sounds like it could be, a legitimate place. But what this actually is, this character here that looks a lot like a P is actually 2 S's. So this place is not clay crop, it's actually clay cross. And as I was reading this, I wanted to make sure, because as I said, clay crop sounds like it could be a place. It sounds legitimate. So I went on to Google and did a search in Google for Derbyshire, England, and added the phrase clay cross and found that Clay Cross actually is a town in Derbyshire. So, with being familiar with how double S's look like P's, I felt confident that it was Clay Cross, but I wanted to double check. And that's very easy to do on something like this where you're talking about a place. Jump onto Google, do a couple searches, and see if you can confirm or deny what that place name is. So some letters to watch out for. As we've talked about, capital L's and S's. O and P can actually be a little confusing sometimes. If that top or that left-hand part of the P is a little faint, or sometimes it'll just be very small, those can actually confuse, as can Q and P. M's and W's. H's and N's, as we saw in that example with the Henrys and the Hugh, it would be pretty easy, excuse me, it would be pretty easy to think that that capital H was an N. And of course, capital F and capital T. Lowercase a, O, and U. Those double S's can easily be confused with F's or P's. H and K. E, and that's actually an I. I know it looks like an L, but that's E and lowercase I. And G and Y can also look very similar. So some general tips for reading old handwriting. Become familiar with the document. Get used to how that person is writing. See if there are peculiarities and find those words that you know what they are. Keep context in mind. What word makes sense? And sometimes you need to step away for a little bit, especially if you're reading a long document like a will or a set of letters or pension paper. Step away for a little bit, and when you come back, you're going to have a fresher set of eyes. Speaking of a fresher set of eyes, sometimes you need to ask someone else. Get someone who hasn't been staring at that document for 3 weeks. Sometimes just having somebody else look at it, they don't have any preconceived notions, or sometimes it just pops out at them. So ask someone else. And finally, keep practicing. It really does get easier. All right, next week on the archives.com live stream, we are going to talk about where in the world finding your ancestors' origins. That will be next Wednesday, July 24th at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. In the meantime, stay connected with archives.com, whether it's on our blog, liking us on Facebook, following us 140 characters at a time on Twitter, and also following us on our YouTube channel. All of the previous live streams are now up on YouTube. I know that a couple people have asked me about last week's YouTube video on the 1900 and 1910 censuses. That is now up on YouTube. And if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you will get an email whenever we add new videos. So that's a great way to stay on top of that. If you are watching this on YouTube later, join us on Wednesdays. Join in the chat room. We try to answer questions and get ideas for everybody to help them with their family history research, and we have a really good time. So until next week, this is Amy Johnson Crow wishing you happy researching.